In 1933, the German Reichstag burned down. It was arson. There was a man that was found inside the building by the name of Marinus van der Lubbe, and he was charged with torching it, and he was a communist. History has not determined whether or not he was actually the perpetrator or whether he was just a convenient person to blame. The Nazis were looking for someone convenient to blame. They said that the communists were the source of all of the problems that Germany had. Well, at least a lot of them. Then, of course, there were the Jews. And then there were the foreigners. So in other words, there were just all sorts of people that they were blaming. But because of the burning of the legislative building in Berlin, Hitler was able to begin his rise to power. And it wasn't long before everything was unrecognizable in Germany. Things were upside down. You could truly say that the foundations had been overturned. In order for us to understand Psalm 11, which is a passage that is talking about Israel during the life of David, when everything went upside down, we need to look at what God's foreign policy is. So next slide, please. Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 and 3 states God's overall foreign policy. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great. Be a blessing. It turns out that the Hebrew there is an imperative rather than a future. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. God has stated there that his foreign policy is one that expects for people outside of Israel to have a favorable attitude towards Israel and to bless it whenever possible. The one who curses it, the one who opposes Israel, the one who says that they ought to be run off into the Mediterranean Sea, God will oppose. But notice also that there is a command at the end of verse 2. After God says that he will make Israel great, Israel is to be a blessing. When we look at the life of Abraham, we see that he often was not a blessing. But God expected for Israel to be a blessing, but regardless, Gentiles are going to be judged based on how they treat the nation of Israel. God makes certain promises. And another promise that will be very important out of the Davidic covenant, next passage, is God's promise that he made to David. He says to David, and your house, and it's talking about his dynasty, the lineage, the house that would rule, such as you've heard of the House of Hanover and all the dynasties that there are in all of the European countries with their kingdoms from years gone by. I will make your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. This doesn't say that David would sit on the throne as long as the throne would last, but the throne is one that is destined to last forever, and the dynasty is one that will not end. And you might say, well, as I look at Old Testament history, it seems like the dynasty did end. Well, let's look at the next slide. Here we have the Davidic dynasty, and we have the first two people, David and Solomon, were kings of the United Kingdom, the kingdom known as Israel. Then with Rehoboam, the nation split into two parts. There was Judah in the south, and that is the lineage that is here. On the other hand, the north, which is known as Israel or Samaria, that had many dynasties because God had not made a promise to Jeroboam. God had made a promise to be faithful to David, and it didn't depend upon how faithful man was. God had made an unconditional covenant. So as we look at the kings, and in one case, queen of Judah, we have David, Solomon, Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, Ahaziah, Athaliah, she was the queen, Joash, Amaziah, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Ammon, Josiah, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, Zedekiah, and then the southern kingdom in 586 BC went into exile. And there has never been a king sitting on the throne of Israel ever since. Now that sounds like God made a promise that he isn't keeping, doesn't it? Well, not so fast. God promised that the kingdom would be established forever, and that the throne would be established forever. There would always be someone qualified to sit on the throne. Interestingly enough, there was a prophecy made to one of the kings saying that none of his descendants, physical descendants, would actually sit on the throne. So it starts looking more and more problematic, but the virgin birth of Jesus made it so that Jesus escaped from that curse that was put upon Jeconiah. And Jesus Christ is the qualified King of Israel, prepared to sit on the throne, and he will indeed sit on the millennial throne, and he will also reign over the eternal kingdom. The promise that God made to David is a sure and secure promise. But during David's lifetime, David could have said, as his advisor said, all hope is lost. God has fallen off his throne and God has forgotten his promise. One could say that if one is looking horizontally. But if one looks with the eyes of faith and sees that God makes faithful promises, even when the circumstances around us look like everything's falling apart, David did not lose hope. I'd like for us to consider the opening passage of this in preparation for our consideration of the psalm as a whole. Notice Psalm 11, and for your Bibles, you'll notice that in the Lord is where verse 1 would start. But actually in the Hebrew Bible, the superscription is part of the text. So I'm going to exposit it. It's part of the Bible. So verse 1a, as we'll call it, to the chief musician, a psalm of David. Now on the slide I have a representation of a kinnor, which is the type of harp that David would have used. And you know that David is very famous for not only writing psalms, but for his playing of the kinnor. He wrote the great bulk of he wrote more psalms than anyone else wrote. And what David is saying is this is a song that is to be sung in public worship. In other words, he's saying there is to be a reminder of the people of the deliverance that happens in this passage. It is not just that David said, oh, wow, today's 4th of July, 1776, wonderful, we have declared independence. Now, next year, forget about it. The year after, forget about it, forget about it, forget about it. No, David is saying this is something that is to be given to the chief choir director so that it shows up in the list of songs, the list of hymns to be sung on a regular basis there in Israel's worship. And it is going to be a reminder of God's faithfulness. Now we need a little bit of background as to why David would utter this psalm. And for that, we have Absalom's hypocrisy and rebellion. And you might wonder why I have an ancient actor's acting mask. one of the words that they used in Greek for an actor was hypocrites, that is, hypocrite. An actor is a hypocrite. He puts on a false face. The face that he puts on is not the face of his birth. It is not what he thinks personally. It is what he wants to convey to people. And what happened in 2 Samuel 15, that we will not go into depth on, Absalom, after having killed his brother, was allowed to return to Jerusalem. But when he came to Jerusalem, he came with an entourage, and he would always stand outside of the city gate and wait for people to come in, and he would say, "Are you planning to see the king? Do you have a problem that you're needing for him to make a decision upon? Well, please tell it to me." And so the person would tell him their story, and Absalom would say, "You know, I really sympathize with you, but unfortunately the king doesn't have anyone that's going to bother to hear your case. You know, if only I could be appointed judge, then there would be justice here in Israel." And before long, Absalom led a rebellion because he had a lot of popular support, and he revolted against David. He had a strong enough military because of some of the people that supported him that David needed to leave Jerusalem. Actually, David chose to leave Jerusalem because if he had stayed there, they would have had battles in the city of Jerusalem and many innocent people would have been killed. So David said, in the interests of the innocent bystanders, we'll step out of the city. So, with that as background, the nation of Israel is in turmoil. David, the one that God had promised would have an eternal throne and whose kingdom would be established forever, all of a sudden has a usurper to deal with, his own son Absalom. And David is not in Jerusalem sitting on the throne. And so David's advisors give him some advice. This is like the president's cabinet. So they have this big meeting. It wasn't in the White House. We don't know where it was. But in verse 1, as it would be in your English Bibles, "In the Lord I put my trust. How can you say to my soul, flee as a bird to your mountain?" The recommendation here was, David, you've got to take off. You don't have an army behind you, and no one can protect you. You need to get out of Jerusalem. You need to get gone. You need to go someplace that it's easy for a small force to protect you. Just hightail it out of here. Get it out of here as fast as you possibly can and go to your mountain. And scholars would believe that this is Masada. And of course, you're familiar with the great stand that took place there in the fight against the Romans a millennia later. Now, let me call your attention to something in verse 1. As you look at your English Bibles, you will notice that before the word flee, that there's a quotation mark, right? And then at the end of verse 1, there is also a quotation mark, right before the question mark. Now this would be a place where it would be handy for you to pull out your text of the passage that I have prepared for you. You'll notice that I have some words that are in yellow. I believe that the quote should go further than it goes. David isn't just saying, "Why do you say to my soul, flee as a bird to your mountain?" His advisors have a reason that they are recommending for him to fly like a bird and get out of there. It is because of the rest of the quote. His advisors say verse 2, and his advisors say verse 3. They say, the reason you need to do it, verse 3, for look, David, the wicked bend their bow. They make ready their arrow on the string that they may shoot secretly at the upright in heart. If the foundations are destroyed, as it's translated here, what can the righteous do? Interestingly, though, that they have translated, what can he do, is not a future tense. It is being translated as an imperfect. It is a perfect tense, and it should be translated, what has the righteous done? I'll show you some other translations that understand this correctly. In fact, they are also in your notes. So the first issue here is that it's a past tense. It is also singular. It is not what have righteous people done, it's what has the righteous one done, and I would argue it should be capitalized. It should be understood as God. Let's recap this. David's advisors are saying, you need to flee. You need to get out of here. The reason you need to get out of here is because you don't know who your enemies are. They are prepared secretly to shoot at you. They are ready to take aim at you, and you don't know who your friends are. You don't know who your enemies are. And what has the righteous one done? He hasn't done a single thing. David, you've got to stand up for yourself because God isn't going to protect you. But David knows that God made a promise. God promised to establish his throne forever. And God promised that the kingdom that David had was one that was going to last forever. David understands from the Davidic covenant that God formally made with him that somehow God has a plan here, and it's not all coming apart just because Absalom has won the public support. And just because Absalom has gotten a few military leaders to cause this coup to take place. Well, let's look at this a little more closely. Next slide. The improved translations that exist, the Geneva Bible in 1599 said, what hath the righteous done? And with the word hath, they are making it very clear that righteous is a singular. What hath the righteous one done? But notice they did not capitalize it. They did not treat it as God. Brenton, in his translation of the Greek Old Testament, said, what has the righteous done? And again, it's has, not have. So he's indicating that he understands it to be a singular. And then in Young's literal translation, he says, the righteous, what hath he done? And again, he understands it as singular. All of these understand it as past tense and singular, that the righteous is a singular. Douay Rheims, which is a Catholic translation, explicitly says that it is a person, not God. They say, what has the just man done? Well, they got it correct that it's singular, they got it correct that it's past, but they explicitly say it's a man. And then in the Jewish Publication Society, in their Old Testament, they say, what hath the righteous wrought? Again, they understand it as singular and as past, but they think it's a person. How does this passage go? For all intents and purposes, next slide. The first passage, verses 1 through 3, David quotes his advisors. He says, you are telling me that I ought to flee as a bird because God has done nothing. And there are all these sneaky enemies ready to attack me, and I had better get off to somewhere that's easy to defend and just go into hiding because God won't protect me. But David says that's inconceivable. because I have put my trust in the Lord. So how can you tell me that I need to act as if God is a nobody, an ostrich who has his head in the sand? So verses 4 through 7 are going to be that David rejects their advice. It doesn't mean that David refuses to leave the city of Jerusalem, but David knows that God is ultimately going to keep his promise. He doesn't necessarily know how God's going to keep his promise, but God is faithful, and David has no doubt about that. And so now he's going to instruct his advisors. Wouldn't that be something if the president would instruct his cabinet when his cabinet gives him bad instructions? That's an interesting thought. Well, let's now look at verses 1b through 3. What we have here is a hunter's blind, and they have set that up, and this is a bow hunter, so he has treaded his bow. That is, he's put the string on it, he's got the bow ready, and he's able to look out through that opening, and here comes the animal, unaware that it's under attack until it's too late. And David's advisors in verse 2 say that's exactly what has happened. Absalom not only has taken over Jerusalem, but he's won the affections of enough people that you don't know who your friends are, you don't know who your enemies are. So if you go out in public, you're in a large group, you might get stabbed, you might get shot with an arrow, you might die. God hasn't done anything to protect the nation. God hasn't done anything to protect you, David. Oh, all is lost. And David says, how can you recommend that? How can you be leaders of this nation and say that I should abdicate and I should run away and I should forget about my responsibility as though God were not in charge? As though God had not made promises, as though God would not keep his promises. So, in verses 4 and following, in verse 2, David mentions what they say about people attacking secretly. But then in verse 3, next slide, this is what his advisors think God is like. An ostrich with its head in the sand. God is there. He doesn't care what's happening. God will let the world all fall apart. He'll allow everything to go haywire. God is absolutely unconcerned, and David, you've got to protect yourself. You know, I have run into people in these days with our tough economic times and with all the turmoil that's going on in Washington, D.C. and all the turmoil around the world who have basically given up. Who say, you know, everything that I could count on, my house has gone down in value, my mortgage is still the same, but I don't have a job. And they look at everything and see it as everything has fallen apart. And they don't know what to do. How does David answer this in this circumstance? What is it that David says? Again, let's look at the outline. David quoted his advisors with their bad advice, and then in verses 4 through 7, he's going to reject their advice. So, in verse 4, and this is an old picture, this is from 1995, but I'm sure you're wondering right now, how in the world would I have a picture of Mile High Stadium, and that of course was its name back in 1995, before it got changed. Why would I have a picture like that in talking about God tests humanity from on high? You're thinking, mile high? Is that what you mean? Well, let's think about it. When a football team trains at elevation, they function pretty well at elevation, don't they? But what happens when those flatlanders come from Miami and all those low-lying places, San Francisco, and that, they kind of have a tough time adjusting to the altitude here. I remember when we moved here, before we bought our house, we were in an apartment, and we got a really good deal. It was on the 3rd floor. And we didn't want to spend too much money because we still owned a place in California, and now we were getting ready to buy a place, so we were trying to keep our cash flow pretty good, so 3 flights. So that meant we arrived with our truck, and we were hauling stuff up to the 3rd floor. Diane and I were so happy because we got in the truck, and we drove off, and George had to finish organizing it. We had to go back to California, and he was the one that initially set up housekeeping. But we were absolutely exhausted because we were used to living only 50 feet above sea level. And here we are, mile high. God puts out tests. And the way that he puts out those tests, it makes it so that believers have an opportunity to excel, believers who are using the Word. But believers who aren't using the Word and unbelievers have a fantastic opportunity to fail the test. So it's kind of like putting someone who's not used to being up at high elevation and expecting them to perform, as opposed to putting someone up there who's ready to perform at high elevation. In other words, God's testing is designed to allow those who are using His Word to excel, but to absolutely expose the failure of those who do not. And so the Lord tests all of humanity from on high. Then in the next verse, we have that the Lord tests the righteous. And here we have a crucible which is heated up, and it allows the purification of a metal, in this case gold. And God uses testing in the lives of believers, especially of believers who are using the Word. And so he says, the Lord tests the righteous. But next slide, what does he do with the wicked and the one who loves violence? His soul hates. God puts punishment on those who are opposing his plan in history. And this is talking about a temporal opposition, a temporal hatred that is in time. This is not a foretaste of the great white throne, because this is a judgment in time that David is speaking about. But what is it then that happens to those who love violence and who are wicked? Next slide. He says that they will have destruction that could be even like that of Sodom and Gomorrah. Notice how he picks up wording from the Genesis 19 passage. Upon the wicked he will rain coals, fire and brimstone, and a burning wind shall be the portion of their cup. And the reason that God acts in this way, testing and allowing to succeed believers who use the Word, and bringing to failure and bringing to destruction those who oppose, is because of what the next verse says. The Lord is righteous. He loves righteousness. His countenance beholds the upright. God has a plan, and during time he favors those who line up with his plan. David is able to say, God is going to deliver us because God has made promises to me. And because I have been faithful to the Lord, he will deliver me in time. Absalom is going to get what Absalom deserves from the Lord, because the Lord is righteous. So how do we look at all this put together? Next slide. In conclusion, If the foundations are destroyed, here we have the tornado in Joplin, Missouri. We can look and we can see everything falling apart around us and say, does God really care? Is God really involved? That's what the world around us is seeing. The world should see that God is able to deal with those that oppose him. They should also hear from us a message of deliverance. Jesus Christ guarantees everlasting life to those who simply believe him for his promise of everlasting life to them. We have a message to carry to a world that is entrapped in a world of destruction that is on a self-destructive course. And we have a responsibility, knowing that God is faithful to what he promises. We need to carry a message of life to a lost and dying world. David was able to encourage his believers, his advisors, his cabinet, and to say, no, you're getting yourself sideways. You've allowed yourself to get trapped by the thinking of people around you that God isn't in charge, that God isn't faithful, that God won't keep his promises. But God is faithful. God is still on his throne and he's still judging planet Earth in time. And God deals with the righteous one way, he deals with the unrighteous in another way, because God is righteous. Let's pray.